YouTube, and
Yep.
I still can't see the stream. It's
Oh,
still showing like the thumbnail.
is it? Okay. It says it's live though, I think.
Yeah, now we are.
Oh gosh. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, now we are live.
Wow. So do you think we just started now?
Yeah, well, just give me a second then, because I know the source of the reverb as well. It's this.
Okay. Right, right. Hey everyone. I don't know if we've been live for. Oh no.
No, we haven't. We haven't, because this was just showing a blank screen.
I think we have been live though. Are you sure?
No, 100%.
That's so strange. Does that mean we have to start again?
Yeah.
Oh wow. Should we start a new stream potentially?
Yes.
So
I mean, we
confused.
can continue. We are live by the way right now. Like everything is.
Right, right. Maybe
Yeah.
someone in the chat can let us know if we've been live this whole time or.
Yeah. Also, Bar has been Bar texted in like, yeah.
Oh,
See, he has
okay, just
started.
started. Oh, that's such a
Yeah.
shame. But all right, let's just get started again. Sorry about the delay, everyone. All right, let's just get started with the stream then. So, obviously, welcome back to the FPL Script. This is season 2, episode 18. This is your Game Week 15 preview, and I'm your co-host, FPL__Fran on X, otherwise just FPL Fran on YouTube. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm with my co-host here, at Schadenfreudist with a 1 on social media platforms X, I think, and that might be pretty much it. But in terms of before we step into Game Week 15, our Game Week 14 reviews just to start off with, and actually just we'll quickly go back to that graphic there. So yeah, ultimately my Game Week was pretty poor as it stands. Had to deal with the Watkins uncertainty. I had the capacity to address it as well within my own free transfers, so I did make that move because I wasn't sure Watkins would play, and unfortunately my bench was awful. It had Archer, it had Cash, it had Porro. I didn't really want my bench coming in this week, so I therefore wanted to sort of balance, I suppose, the loss of Watkins or the potential loss of Watkins with someone who also had, an equivalently good fixture in Darwin. As it turns out, obviously that's 9 points down the field. And the rest of my team, I had the Palmer knock to deal with as well, which was obviously the surprise news from yesterday, where I think he got a knock in training, and that sort of precluded him from starting versus Brighton. However, Chelsea still put a good performance despite sort of playing 10 versus 11 for most of the match. They also drew a penalty, which he was not on the field to take, but we saw Enzo take that. So I guess we have some sort of inkling about order, with Nkunku being out still. But I think Palmer will still be on penalties. That's not really a concern from our point of view. My issue, of course, is with my team. I was just pretty upset about the outcomes because obviously didn't really want to deal with Watkins, but had to ultimately. My other transfer would have been just to go Zinchenko, which would have left me benching Kobel, but I would have taken, for example, 7 points as opposed to being in the position that I am, which is where, for example, a small little red arrow here, I suppose, close to safety for some managers has dropped me basically back to where I was 2 weeks ago at around 43k in the world. But what about you, JD?
Yeah. So as Fran was talking about, he expected a good week, and I think I expected a good week for him as well. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And it was the exact opposite for me. I was expecting a rather middling to, let's say, suboptimal week for my team, given the fact that Eze was injured, and I kept him because I made transfers on Monday, and somehow it didn't backfire in the end because Watkins played. I had Livramento sub ready in case Watkins didn't play, so I gained 4 points because of the fact that Watkins played and scored and assisted and got 2 bonus points. So I'm not too feeling too lucky there, but overall, I think I'm definitely lucky as FPLOptimize.com has also told me I'm lucky by a very tiny margin, but all the same. And uh, when it comes to the rest of my team, Pinnock lost a clean sheet against Luton. Not great. I mean, I guess Flecken owners are in the same boat as me, and me is in a different boat because he scored and assisted a goal. Simikas got the assist. That was, I think, the only positive, and that prevented a complete wipe out of all clean sheets. At least one of my defense got something to talk about. Mbumo got subbed early, got an assist, and we'll talk about Mbumo later. Son, obviously great. Saka, great. Managed to get his bonus point back from when he had lost it to Bentley. And that's about it. Yeah, we can move on to the next game mix preview.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we decided to do with the midweek sort of game week here, where I think the easiest thing to do is, for example, just go through each fixture, go through the talking points as fast as possible before we sort of finalize with 2 other segments that we have planned for today. In terms of the first fixture, of course, this is Wolves versus Burnley. Key thing, of course, is Hwang, of course, is an incredible pick, particularly after the sort of baseline updates with the penalties sort of being priced in. Obviously, it might be the case that Kunha takes penalties if he, for example, draws the penalty himself. I think it might be quite open, to be honest, depending on who draws. But let's say, assuming that none of them draw the penalty, if let's say someone else was to draw the penalty, I think it's more than likely Hwang would take the penalty given that he scored the previous one. So that's my assumption. The issue, of course, with Hwang is he's on 4 yellow cards, which sort of precludes him, I think, from a lot of managers being as a transfer option. But of course, I think if you have a wild card in the back pocket, and that's probably the best way to approach Hwang. I feel like you have that sort of security in thinking I can go for a very, very attacking punt. And when you, for example, compare Hwang as an option to anyone in that sort of price bracket, I think he actually, for example, still absolutely smokes Gordon, even on odds or even on review. So that's why I do think he's worthwhile as a punt, but really, if you only had a wild card left.
Yeah, and the other player that we wanted to mention for this game is Bentley, who is the backup goalkeeper for Wolves. Obviously, Jose Sa got an injury and got subbed before 30 minutes, so Bentley came on, kept a clean sheet, got a bonus point as well. Nearly stole the bonus point from Saka, but Saka being Saka, he got it back. Because of the fact that we have so many 3.9 to 4 million goalkeepers all of a sudden available for short term to medium term, I don't think he's anywhere close to like the top of the pecking order. So once we talk about all the other goalkeepers that are in sort of a similar price bracket, you'll see why we don't think Bentley is anywhere near close to consideration. So I think that's all for that game. We can move on to the next game, which is Luton Arsenal. This being the second, like the second game from kickoff or the first game of the week, I am hopeful that there we will get some injury news or other team news for Gabriel and Zinchenko, and injury news in terms of Tomiyasu. Uh, for Gabriel and Zinchenko, I have slight doubts as to whether they'll start. Both of us are Gabriel owners, and I would ideally like to know if he starts with in the form of some team leagues. But Fran already pointed out to me that in Game Week 14, Arsenal's game was the first game after deadline, and we got no news about any of the players. So if that is the case, then on from what we've seen, I would definitely start Gabriel. I don't think there's any need to worry for this game. But if there is a chance that we get a team league and we get a league that Gabriel is benched, then I will look to make a defensive transfer because my team is like on the verge of collapse. If we look at like the structure, so any player out, and I would definitely need to make that. Otherwise, my transfer is pretty much fixed, and Fran will and I will get to it when we talk about it. But anything else, Fran, in terms of Arsenal defense that you think we should look at?
Yeah, I think the key thing obviously is that that Tomiyasu injury that you mentioned, right? Because that just means that QER is the only player who can really rotate with Gabriel and Zinchenko. We've seen Kira rotate with Zinchenko in the Champions League. We've also seen Kira rotate with Gabriel in the Sheffield United game. So, yeah, I think the concern obviously is just whether Zinchenko deserves to be dropped for whatever reason, and part of that is maybe because of the impact of, let's say, something like maybe Aston Villa being a game to prioritize. I don't know, Zinchenko playing, and maybe Zinchenko still deserves some rest. I'm not sure. I think there's because of that Champions League rest, I think Zinchenko is probably good to go for the next three if he's needed and Tomiyasu is out. So I would obviously just wait for Tomiyasu news first. But Zinchenko obviously right now is just a monster whenever he plays. The expected value is there's a huge gulf honestly with Zinchenko when he plays 90 minutes between, let's say, someone like Saliba. You can see it so evidently in the bonus points, whether he gets an assist or not. That's just the reality right now. So yeah, it does feel like a little bit sour, I think, from a Gabriel Saliba point of view, other than the fact that Saliba also scored versus Burnley. But that feels bad, I suppose. But now, at the same time, I just don't think you'd be investing, for example, in double Arsenal defense on this week. Last week, it probably made sense to do so when you, for example, have Game Week 14 in mind. But right now, I definitely wouldn't be that interested in Arsenal defense, even though the singular fixture of Luton is very, very good. What do you think about Raya as well, in general?
Yeah, I think what I talked about goalkeepers when I mentioned Bentley is kind of the same thing that applies here. I think because of the options that have opened up in the past week or so, Raya is not that great of an option if you're looking to buy. I think if you own, I think he's still a great option. I don't think there is any need to transfer him out. But just the fact that you can get probably most of the expected value out of a cheaper goalkeeper for, let's say, saving 0.8 million, then I don't think it's a competition. Like I think the clear winner is the cheaper goalkeeper with nearly the same expected value. So I would not go for Raya, but if you own, it's like the classic case of don't own, don't buy. But if you own, you don't need to sell and don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, makes sense. Next game, of course, is Brighton versus Brentford. This is obviously the day after, so this is Wednesday. These are the Wednesday fixtures. I think the only news is really Mbumo. First of all, from the Brentford point of view, he was subbed for the first time, before 90 minutes. It seemed like apparently he signaled to the bench that he needed to be taken off. We'll see obviously what happens in terms of an Mbumo update, but that's quite significant obviously if he has an injury. Otherwise, I think if it's not an injury related situation, something to think about in terms of whether Mbumo becomes a transfer out. But as we were talking before the podcast started as well, actually, it seems more than likely that a lot of us will be taking Mbumo out. And part of that is because we own a couple of players that will be heading towards the Asian Cup or AFCON. So in this
Mm.
sort of landscape, it makes sense that you plan a transfer out for either Salah or Mbumo, in my opinion, on Gameweek 18, given that obviously Liverpool have some pretty tough fixtures, 18 and 20, because actually Son probably is the best option, I would say, to keep all the way until Asian Cup starts, right? So that's sort of the landscape. What do you think about the Brighton picks as well? For example, João Pedro and maybe Adingra, who you still own, right?
No, I
Oh, you
sold
do.
Adingra for Mbumo,
Ah, right.
but
Okay.
I still think that given the minutes, he is a great pick.
Yeah.
Just that the fixtures for Mbumo are much better, so I had to do that.
Yeah.
But let's say if I were a better FPL manager and I had kept a hold of Mbumo for the past couple of fixtures, then I would have still kept. Maybe I would have sold him in six. I will sell him in 16 if that were the case for Cole Palmer, but because I own neither of them, I had to make a move for Mbumo. So Adingra had to go, but I still think he's a great pick for his minutes and the fact that he's great on market odds, especially. For João Pedro, I am totally baffled by what's happening. Brighton have players that are dropping like flies every single week, and yet he somehow finds himself on the bench every single week, whatever may be the case. Now, I heard from some Brighton fan that it could also be the case that Bonanotte could also play number 10, apparently. And it looks like De Zerbi wants something from João Pedro that he's not getting currently in terms of tactics. And he's hell bent on making sure that João Pedro like adheres to what he wants. Because every game João Pedro is coming on, he's scoring right now. So even if you, let's say, own him, you're not getting the MD you want, you're not getting the XG rank you want, but I think you're getting the points you want because um, FPL Flapjack posted that he scored 20 points from the bench in the past 3 or 4 weeks, which is like a lot of points. So if you're one of those that only looks at points, yeah, I mean, you're getting the points, but it's not like a predictable source, right? Because you don't know how much he's going to play, if he's going to play, stuff like that. So I would definitely stay away from Joao Pedro.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean that's kind of that for that game. We can move on to probably the next game, which is Crystal Palace versus Bournemouth. First of all, Fran and I am just reminding anyone that follows the podcast. Fran and I have a bet as to which team finishes like below the other, and Fran is betting on Fulham finishing higher, and I'm betting on Bournemouth finishing higher. The problem is both clubs are looks like they're hell bent on outperforming each other every week because Fulham nearly got a result against Liverpool and Bournemouth nearly got a result against Aston Villa. And I think both of them performed admirably in attack. It's just that their defenses are not that good, and we knew that. It's nothing new. So in terms of Bournemouth assets, I think Semenyo is the one that is probably new to probably the landscape. Him being 4.6 and having decent underlines. Fran mentioned that he had 0.21 non-penalty XG per 90, which is not bad if you compare him to someone like Cameron Archer, who is probably dead as an asset right now in FPL. And I had the misfortune of getting him as an auto sub this week. So I know full well the extent of misfortune that comes with owning Cameron Archer and having to play him. I'm not Matty H. I don't get 2 goals from Cameron Archer. I get 1 point and a 45th minute sub. Right. So, what do you think about Palace defense? By the way, would you play Palace defense this week?
Yeah, I think you have to. This is basically the last good Palace fixture in quite a while. And then after this, you've got a good chance to really move on to a lot of 4.5s that will probably be, emerging on our horizon, right? So you have For example, like if you see Cobble play again versus Man United, I think he becomes a very good option on 16-17, or even earlier if you really are in desperate need of a 4.5. Alternatively, you've got maybe just the ability to just, for example, deposit an Aston Villa center back on your bench, and at 4.5 as well. I mean, I'm trying to think if there's any other options really in FPL. I think I remember looking at, for example, I think, yeah, for people who, for example, have Raya, like it makes a lot of sense to actually own it made a lot of sense to own a Crystal Palace defender, just because you need some of these Crystal Palace defenders to just be your third defender slot on these weeks. But yeah, I think the time has pretty much come at an end, and also it doesn't really seem like they're actually as good as a defense as we thought they were. Usually they do end up being, for example, a top 10 team in terms of xGC, if I remember correctly. So last 2 seasons they've been fourth. And obviously ranking isn't necessarily how we want to look at teams, but I do believe that they're closer, for example, to being like a mid-table defense as opposed to, for example, top 4, top 5 defense this season. So that's a slight change, I suppose. And obviously Bournemouth's a bit of a surging attack as well, because if looking at, for example, something like the 11-5 team model, the Bournemouth attack is definitely, for example, leveling up a lot. And me, considering our Fulham bet in hand, I think that I'm a little bit worried about that as well. So we'll see how things go. But I think that's the only thing I'd say about Crystal Palace. I think you just look for new transfer options for the next few weeks.
Absolutely, yeah. I think we can move on to the next fixture, which is Fulham Forest. I'm just going to mention to the chat that we'll get to any questions that you have. It's just that we wanted to get through the podcast we were recording a podcast, so we'll just get through the rest of the fixtures and then we can probably address some of the questions. So getting back to the fixture at hand, I think the big talking point here is Willian being benched, because last week was a week where all of a sudden you had sub 6 million players on penalties coming up, like Wang, Willian, Cole Palmer, and all of a sudden one of them has dropped out again. Because if he is not like guaranteed to start every single week, I don't see the point in bringing a player like that in. And also, I'm going to check this and correct myself on YouTube, but from what I remember, Pereira had come off the pitch before Willian took the penalty. So I don't know if
No,
he
no,
is
no,
on
no.
penalty.
Pereira's on the pitch. Willian
He
took
was
the
okay.
penalty. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, sorry, my bad then. He is on penalties, but we don't know the minute situation. So if that is the case, then I'm not going to go for a player like that. Um, I I need to give a shout out to Formadillo, because Formadillo has had horrendous luck for like a season and a half, but he's gotten the Robinson pick pretty well. Although he's only played in for 1 week, so he's not gotten a lot of points out of him. But at least as a pick, I think he's probably as nailed as possible for a Fulham fullback, given the fact that Castagna was benched this week for Tete. Do you have any thoughts about the Forest midfield or attack in general?
Not really. I think, yeah, I mean, probably the safest midfielder right now in terms of minutes is Morgan Gibbs-White. So if, for example, you're like a little bit worried about, let's say, Palmer's minutes, then it probably makes sense to invest into him. Just given that he's like a very stable option. As you said, for example, Hwang, 4 yellow cards. Willian, obviously, unstable minutes. Palmer, really just depends on how you evaluate the knock. But yeah, I mean, if you really want true safety, and that's sort of your approach, like being risk averse, I think Morgan Gibbs-White's just the best option.
Yeah, and I think both of us agree that even though Chris Wood is the striker, first of all, he is not guaranteed to be on the pitch for 90 minutes.
Yep.
And second of all, I just think that, I don't know why, but my belief is shifting to the fact that even if he were on the pitch, I still think Morgan Gibbs-White will possibly take the penalty. You agree, right?
Yeah, that could very likely happen, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So if that's the case, then yeah, unfortunately, we don't have any way of changing the penalty weightage assigned to each player in a review right now. But hopefully one day we will, because that could lead to all sorts of spicy possibilities and variations in solves. Yeah. The next game is Sheffield United Liverpool. The one thing I'm going to say about Sheffield United, obviously, is that it's probably the worst defense I've ever seen. Conceding 5 goals to Burnley is totally unacceptable. Even though I'm probably bitter about the fact that Charlie Taylor got an assist and a bonus point as a part of that. And there was like, as soon as the game started, I knew there was no way that Sheffield were going to score. Now they might get a lucky goal here or there, but as a matter of like pattern of play or looking good in attack, like for example, as you mentioned, Bournemouth is looking better and better under Iraola. I don't see that happening under current management. So I'm definitely looking at captaining Salah. We'll talk about the captaincy later on as well. But the biggest talking points are from Liverpool side, obviously, with Darwin and Tsimikas, who are maybe a doubt to start. What are your thoughts on both of these players?
Yeah, I actually think Darwin's probably more likely to start than Simicas. Mostly because when you take Jota out of the picture, actually, you could argue, let's say if if the midfield's unchanged, that Gakpo would take one of the spots between Darwin and Luis Diaz, right? Because in theory, Darwin can always play left wing. And I think actually it's more likely that we see Gakpo come into the midfield and that Darwin continues to start versus Sheffield United. But I wouldn't be 100% certain about that. Ultimately, though, it's such a good fixture where, look, if you can get Darwin for 30 to 40 minutes versus Sheffield United, I think you're happy in that situation and you'd keep him. It's not even like a situation where you think about this is a chance for me to sell Darwin. I think you just think that if he gets rested, that's going to be that one landing spot where he gets rested. After that, he probably should get starts. And another thing too, of course, is Liverpool are completely secure when it comes to the Europa League, so they can just easily rotate there. Even for example, for Simicas, they can easily play Chambers, the left back academy prospect, there in the Europa League fixture. And in theory, maybe Simicas has a decent chance of starting versus Sheffield United. Although I think it could be a bit unlikely since Joe Gomez he's there and he's ready to deputize. What's nice too, I suppose, is that you have, for example, the situation where Matip seems injured, Konate is there, so they're pretty frail anyways as it is. So look, if they have to play Simicas, I think 3 fixtures in a row, they might do it if for example, Simicas can be trusted. And I think the fact that he played quite well in the fixture in the Etihad, and I don't think he was necessarily super at fault for any of the goals other than maybe the third Fulham
Yeah, I was
goal.
going to say,
Yeah, that's I think something that probably Liverpool will just have to sort of accept, right? Playing Simicas, and he probably, I'd definitely start him because we're not going to get any information in terms of whether he starts
Oh
or
yes,
not, and
yeah,
that's sort of the situation right now.
yeah. I definitely agree with both of the points. So we can probably move on to the next game. And also, sorry, briefly to mention Kelleher as well. We
Mm.
knew the drop off, right? No one was like debating the drop off from the greatest Premier League goalkeeper of all time, possibly,
Okay.
to to I'm not going to even try to pronounce his first name, but I'm just going to see Keller. So
Yeah.
with Keller, I don't think anyone doubted the drop off, but I think we expected something better than Adrian, and I think this was like a quintessential Adrian performance from what I saw. It was chaotic. There was like no method to the madness, unlike Allison. So
Mm.
it's I would not expect as many clean sheets, but I still think like the fixtures are pretty good. So there's
Right.
no need to get rid of Simicas for that reason. But I think from what I remember, the solves that I run on review, every single one asks me to get rid of Simicas in 16. I think
Yep.
so. That might be something that I do anyway. But you said it perfectly. I'm going to start him this week, even if he's benched. I'll just take whatever minutes he gets.
Question
And I
actually
also think Darwin starts. Yeah.
on Kelleher, for example, because obviously Liverpool are a team I think that concede a lot more shots than Newcastle. Do you think, for example, like that would be a situation where you'd say it's much more integral that you have a keeper who's actually great at shot stopping, for example? And do you think, for example, like the drop off, because I imagine Dubravka is obviously nowhere near the shot stopper that Pope is,
Yes.
and Pope is
Yes.
usually, as far as I've seen, a positive shot stopper, anyways. So do you think, for example, there's going to be a bigger gulf in terms of like, in theory, EV between, let's say, Allison and Kelleher versus, let's say, Pope and Dubravka, or do you think it should be relatively the same? Imagining that Dubravka is going to play poorly, I suppose.
But you mentioned the fact that Dubravka's PSXG, I think career PSXG,
Mhm.
is also way like better than the average goalkeeper.
Yeah.
So if that is the case, then the drop off is there, I think, from other parts of the game, which if you look at, let's say, a goalkeeping model like John Harrison's,
Yeah.
where he considers all of the other aspects of goalkeeping into XG, unlike just pure shots on target, then I think you will find more of a gap between those two. But just for PSXG, post shot XG perspective, I still think uh, Allison to Kelleher drop off is massive compared to the other one. So for example, for Trent, right? I'm sure no one is going to get rid of Trent because that has happened. Because you've seen it. He conceded 3 goals and ended up scoring a goal and giving an assist. I know that's not going to happen every week. He said that himself that it doesn't happen often. But still you know that he's going to probably provide something, and his career XA is absolutely reliable. So I don't think it changes much from that perspective. But let's say someone like Van Dijk, if you were to go for him, maybe that changes your thought process behind getting him, because you are kind of depending on clean sheets as the primary source of points. But that's a good question actually. That's food for thought for both situations, I think, for Liverpool as well as Newcastle's.
Cool, makes sense. Let's quickly move on
Yeah.
to Aston Villa versus Man City. Now, obviously, the news is that Rodri is out because of the suspension due to accumulation of cards.
Yeah.
Watkins obviously was back, which of course was depressing for me, less depressing for you. That was amazing for you, actually. But also, technically, of course, that's going to nerf the way we evaluate City, and it's going to make the Watkins slightly better as a pick. Obviously, I don't think anyone was really thinking about moving away from Watkins. So the talking points really are Diaby and Cash. For me, I think the first thing I would say from my sort of understanding of Aston Villa is I actually expected Diaby and Cash to be benched.
Yeah.
Because actually, if you've been reading, for example, the way Unai Emery lines up in the Europa League, I feel like it really gives you a really good indication of who he's going to bench, in that weekend fixture. And previously, we've been seeing a lot of Bailey starts in the Europa League. We've been seeing, for example, John Duran starts. The only time I remember they played like a full strength 11, it was very obvious because Watkins was playing. So whenever you see Watkins not on the field, I think it's pretty indicative that it's the Aston Villa B team for the most part. And we have probably approached the stage in the season where, particularly when the fixtures are coming thick and fast, that Cash is probably still the first choice right back, but no longer necessarily needing to play every single fixture because Diego Carlos can easily come in and then Konsa can move to right back. On top of that, too, I think with Diaby, Bailey himself has been playing well. So doesn't necessarily mean that Diaby's minutes are guaranteed, and with Watkins back, that's just one less position that Diaby can occupy. So I think both of them are obviously sells in terms of, I think, Diaby being a priority sell, but with Cash, I think the question really is just, can you afford to hold Cash up until Game Week 18? And actually, if that seems to be the case, then maybe you don't need to exercise any transfers around Cash in the short term. I don't know if you have any sort of additional thoughts on that.
No, I think you covered all the points about Aston Villa's starting 11. One thing I would mention is I was always putting Conser's minutes as 90 when I was running some solves. I would not do that anymore because
Okay.
he was obviously subbed for Cash when they needed to get a goal. I
Mhm.
know that those kind of situations are entirely dependent on game state, but that is what we consider, right, when we are putting in X-Mins for every player. And that does makes Konsa not a 90-minute player. So I know it doesn't change much in terms of no one is going to get suggested Aston Villa players before 18. I think 18 is the time where review is still kind of suggesting Diaby because of a lack of other options. Liverpool playing Arsenal being the big factor there, and the other being if your defense is quite bad for that week. So for that reason, I think Pau Torres is now my clear first choice if I were to bring in an Aston Villa defender, because he seems to be immune to any kind of game state. He's going to play 90 minutes regardless. So that would be the only change I would make based on what I've seen in the past couple of weeks and especially this week based on game state. Other than that, for Man City, as you pointed out, Rodri is going to miss the next game. Grealish is going to miss the next game. Doku is probably going to miss the next game, given the fact that he got a knock. So Foden is as nailed as they come for next week, I think. Especially if we get the news that Doku is out. I don't know if you think he is a good buy right now. I don't know. I'm always on the fence with him, but his minutes have been excellent up and until now, and they continue to be.
Yeah. Sorry, we're talking Foden, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I think he's probably just accumulated a lot of minutes as of late. Because if you think even back to the Champions League fixtures, he's been playing and starting those. Where, for
Yeah.
example, Julian Alvarez has been getting some rest. So
Oh, did we conjure Luke, by the way? Like we started talking about Man City and Luke is in the chat. That's crazy.
yeah, it's actually quite
That's crazy.
magical. And we also
Yeah, yeah.
conjured Flapjack when we were talking about João Pedro,
Yeah, that's actually
which
crazy.
is
Anyway, yeah.
great. But
Sorry,
yeah,
sorry, I
I
interrupted
mean,
you. Yeah,
talking about Foden, right? It's one of those things where if free at 18 was an option, I think I'd definitely be moving into him. I wouldn't be really too worried about his minutes. But
yeah.
sadly, we're probably not going to get that news next week, and if we don't, actually, it seems like, on Ben's sort of suggestion, it doesn't seem like that double game week 20 will
Mm.
come to fruition. So I feel like Foden is such an exclusive transfer for some people. You probably keep holding him until 18 if you own him, and you just don't consider him, unfortunately, as a manager who doesn't own Foden. But I think he's a lovely pick still, and I wouldn't be too worried about his minutes. But that's my personal point of view. Probably Luke has a better one.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the other player, obviously, and we've talked about it at length, is Alvarez,
Hmm.
who also continues to get great minutes despite people
What a shock!
predicting.
What a shock!
Yeah, what a shock, right? Yeah, and again, you predicted it way before, like many managers thought he would get good minutes. What do you think now? Do you think anything has changed? Do you expect him to keep getting good minutes?
Yeah, I mean, nothing's gonna change until De Bruyne's back, right? Which is and to be fair, I'd never predicted Alvarez minutes. I just listen to people who predict better than
Yeah,
myself. So
fair,
yeah,
fair. Okay,
yeah.
yeah,
All right, United versus Chelsea is the next fixture. I think from a Chelsea point of view, obviously the question is about Palmer. We talked about how he has a knock. Personally, for me, I don't like to overreact on things like that. I think Mudrik's very clearly second choice, right? And there's no reason really for Palmer to not be starting fixtures. And Pochettino himself confirmed the knock, so I wouldn't be too upset about Palmer right now. For example, I think we don't need to necessarily have Palmer's 90 minutes, that sort of type of player. But look, on 75 minutes, Palmer's already an amazing pick in FPL. So for me, I'm hoping that of course he just plays versus Man United, because unfortunately that's just the dire sort of position that my team is in, right, with Haaland, Salah sort of forcing a lack of sort of available options during this period. But I'm not too worried about Palmer. But I think that another talking point in terms of United is probably you'd probably be best to go through this with us. I think just the constant question of Dallow's minutes, extending, I suppose, all the way to the Bournemouth fixture. Like, what do you generally think about him? Because we also saw Luke Shaw center back, I suppose.
yes, and I had this discussion with a lot of people who were looking to bring in Maguire, let's say. Not that I suggested it to anyone, because the time to bring him in had long gone, I think, by the time we got to the Newcastle fixture. But regardless, my thought process has always been that Varane is clearly out. We've talked about it time and again. There's something wrong. It's not going to happen. He's not going to come back into the starting 11, or at least not as part of the first 11, let's say. So if Maguire is going to keep playing right center back, you either need a left-footed center back when it's playing against difficult teams, or you at least need Lindelof. So it's either Luke Shaw or Lindelof right now who's going to be the left center back. So if you look at, like, on balance, Dalot can either play left back when Luke Shaw plays left center back, or right back when Luke Shaw plays left back. So on X Mins, that leads me to think that his X Mins should still be pretty good, because it's a weighted sum of his minutes at left back and his minutes at right back, unlike Van Bissaka. And we've also seen that Van Bissaka seems like he's come back from a big injury. So it seems like they're trying to make sure there's no reoccurrence of that, because we've been pretty notorious when it comes to players getting re-injured, and a lot of muscular injuries in the team right now. So I don't think Van Bissaka is going to be able to play, let's say, 2 to 3 games in a week. And given the fact that we desperately need him for the Bayern game, because it's either going to be Kingsley Coman or Sane on his flank. Either of them are a terrifying prospect at this point. So he will definitely play that game. And if you backtrack from that, Dalot should play, for sure, he should play one of the 2 games. And given the fact that Chelsea is, again, a difficult fixture on paper, I believe, like from a United perspective, it almost all of them seem to be at this point. But I think he'll probably persist with Luke Shaw at centre back, and that means that Delo would still play left back. So for the next 2 games, I would still have his minutes pretty high. That is my belief, and I don't see any reason to change that belief based on what we've seen.
Okay, makes sense.
Yeah.
I just want to shout out Man United for conceding one of the few goals that Sheffield United will eventually end up scoring for the
Oh yeah,
23-24
yeah.
season. So
It's
yeah.
like the Derby season where I forgot who they won their one game against, and that was like that team will always remember that as the one team that lost to Derby that season.
Yeah. All right. Next sort of set of fixtures would be on the final day, so Thursday. Everton versus Newcastle. Look, honestly, this is going to be just the Dubravka segment, I suppose. Before we touch on the other two sort of popular Newcastle picks that are sort of still a little bit less owned, but Dubravka, we've been saying how he makes too much sense, I think, as a keeper transfer. And it really just, I don't think we're going to get a genuine update from Eddie Howe. Maybe he will actually confirm surgery, but if he confirms surgery, I think Dubravka just is just the most brain dead option. It's
Yeah.
too easy as a transfer, and yeah, I'd be shocked to see that the field doesn't move entirely towards him. But even if, let's say, Pope has a short-term shoulder injury, I think that's a couple weeks out. And I think given that the landscape is right now such that we don't really have too many transfers to book, a lot of us are still looking at rolling transfers. Um, unless you're, for example, changing a lot of the defaults, or if suddenly there's the miraculous injury that we have to address, a lot of people are still looking at rolling their free transfers, right, up until Gameweek 18, when they have
Yeah.
probably some sort of combination of, let's say, going Mbumo out, or just something to bring Watkins in if you've, for example, recently taken Watkins out. So I think in that landscape, you're basically saying, do I have the opportunity to, let's say, lift the sort of floor of my team and just go Dubravka in the short term, take that punt, regardless of whatever Howe says, and just make that move? For me, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I'm going to do that Dubravka move. But I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yes, so this is the goalkeeper that I was mentioning from the beginning of the podcast. So because Dubravka now exists, I think he makes almost all other goalkeeping options obsolete if you want to bring a goalkeeper in. And I ran a couple of solves on FPL review. So one of the solves was considering he plays for, let's say, the next 5 weeks, and then a sudden drop in his minutes. And uh, from the most optimal path with the given minutes, that the path where I bring in Dubravka this week was off by zero point 0.9 over 12 weeks.
Hmm.
So that's almost nothing. And then what I did was, once I had that solve ready, I changed Dubravka's minutes to 0, because I wanted to see, let's say, that we don't have any update on Newcastle by the time the deadline comes around, and I still make that transfer. And let's say Pope is fine and he plays the next game. What should I be doing? So even if that happens, I'm only losing around 2 EV over the next 12 weeks if
Wow.
that happens.
Okay.
So if that is the case, I think it's a relatively risk-free transfer for me. And I'm just, frankly, I'm just sick of Areola. I really am. I'm so sick of him. I'm just sick of the sight of every single week. And I think the breaking point was against Burnley, because I was so sure, like, come on, like, you have to keep a clean sheet now. And the way they conceded a goal in that game, I was done in that game, frankly. But this was like absolutely like I'm done with this now. So Dubravka is definitely going to be my transfer in, unless we get a team leak about Gabriel. That would be the only way I don't bring in Dubravka this week. And the next player I'm going to talk about is Livramento, because he's in my team and I'm currently starting him. But if you look at, let's say, load management, or let's say the minutes of these players, and the fact that Hall played instead of Livramento previously before the first Champions League game, or not the fourth, but match day 5. If that is the case, and they definitely need Livramento for match day 6, and the difficult fixture on the weekend, which is Tottenham Hotspur away, I think there is a definite chance that he might be rested
Hmm.
for Hall,
Yeah.
because Hall is quite a competent player. It's not as if it's a big drop off from there. I think Hall is a pretty good player. So there is every reason that they play Hall in that game and bring back Livramento for the two difficult fixtures. So I'm not too hopeful, but again, my options are playing Maguire versus Chelsea. So I'm going to trust that that happens, or trust the fact that he does not come on. But I think he most definitely will come on if that's the case, because Trippier also needs a rest. So if Trippier needs a rest, let's say around 70-75 minutes,
Hmm.
it could easily be that Trippier comes out and Livramento goes in. So I don't think there's a way that Livramento stays out for 90 minutes, but it's just, I'm just hoping at this point that he either plays 0 or 90, because my alternative is not that great in terms of expected value.
That's fair. I mean, just going back to Livramento, Trippier's fitness is actually incredible for someone of
It
his
is
age. I mean, the fact that he also
100%.
plays international duty as well,
Yeah,
quite mental. So yeah, I do think you're right that Lewis Hall probably should come in the Everton fixture,
yeah.
but then even maybe could make sense to actually just give Livramento some rest so he can prepare for that really important AC
Milan
Milan
game.
game. Yeah,
Exactly. The
it's
Milan
tough.
game, he is dead set to start. I don't think there's any
Yeah,
argument about that. So I'm just trying to backtrack from that point in time. So that just makes me very iffy about Livramento's minutes in the near future.
that's fair. And I think, yeah, you
Yeah.
probably just have to start him and just hope for the best.
Yeah. Yeah,
Because
exactly.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then the last one's just Gordon, and Gordon, of course, is sort of my
Your boy, your poster boy.
my poster boy, but obviously the poster boy who I'm 20 points down without, I suppose, now that I've gone to Palmer and Gameweek 13. Yeah, I mean, Gordon's one of those picks where we've been talking about how, there's always a huge contrast between how he's evaluated on review versus odds. And then actually, if you just look, for example, at the implied review goal scoring odds versus market versus, let's say, his actual underlying stats, there's a huge drop off between, let's say, review and his actual underlying stats, I would say, and an even larger gulf between that and market odds. So I think the thing about Gordon is this is one of those cases where when you move into a better situation and when you actually are playing all these minutes for 90 minutes on and your underlying stats are basically staying on par, eventually we're going to hit a point in the season where we're going to say it really doesn't make sense to for example, downgrade our expectation of Gordon just because, of course,
Yeah.
he doesn't have that those historic baselines. I think we did that, for example, last season with Isaac, right? Where eventually at one point in the season we generally thought he's a great option. And the same with really Wilson, in his stint with Newcastle, because it's not like he has always enjoyed crazy high underlying stats, particularly when, for example, he was playing for Bournemouth. So I think Gordon's one of those picks where if you've been owning him and it feels bad maybe because your MD is not being reflected, I'd probably just keep him at this point, even though he's got two tough away fixtures, because how much upside do you really stand to gain moving into Palmer, who could have slightly shakier minutes during this run, when you can actually basically have Gordon, who in my opinion could be a season keeper. And for example, that's the regret that I have now, just looking back at it. But I can look at it from that point of view. But I don't know what your thoughts are on Gordon, for
No,
example.
I was right now when you were talking about Gordon, I think the only reason I can justify why you got rid of him is because there are too many midfielders on penalties in the game.
Mm. Yeah, that's fair.
That's probably the only reason. And that is a more than a fair reason, I think. The outcome has been absolutely shocking in terms of Palmer versus Gordon in the last 2 weeks. But I think that the excuse, or not the excuse, but the reason why you did that is perfectly valid. No one knew that Palmer was going to get a knock, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
completely circumstantial. So I don't think I understand it's easier to say that when I haven't done the same, but I reassure you, I guess, that I don't think it's a bad move in any sense. I just think you've been massively unlucky in both directions, I think. But Gordon remains a good pick regardless, I think.
Mm.
So if you are one of those managers that does not put much weightage into players on penalties, then I don't see any player who is better than Gordon at his price.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think I'm sort of
Yeah.
reminded of, like, we've been happy to at various points of the season like move into a player like Sterling or Foden, and
Yeah.
we've talked about
Yeah.
Foden earlier as well. Like these are players that are perfectly good to own at any point, as long as they have good runs and good minutes. So for me, yeah, Gordon just falls into that sort of category of a player. Yeah. And moving on, we've got Tottenham versus West Ham. So this is an interesting one because obviously following along the exact topic that we came off of, we're now sort of talking about players like Kulusevski, for example, from Tottenham, Kudus from West Ham, and then obviously Bowen, who these are all players who aren't necessarily super rated on review. Their underlying stats are all quite good, with exception to Kudus, I would say. He probably just hasn't played enough minutes in the Premier League for us
Mm.
to say,
Yeah.
okay, we can actually have a nice, healthy baseline for him in the Prem. But these are all players who've been doing well, anyways, as it stands in terms of FPL this season, who seem like they're important players for their teams, particularly with the injuries in the West Ham front for Kudus, and Bowen, of course, playing center forward. What do you generally think about like these picks and how they're, for example, evaluated?
So I don't have any strong opinions when it comes to Kulusevski,
Yeah,
just because I haven't thought about him as much as you have, and I would defer to your opinion when it comes to how you think his baseline should go. But for Kudus, I definitely think you're right. We, as we see him getting regular 90s, as he has been getting in the recent past, we will definitely see his true underlines, I think. And when I say true underlines, I mean what his underlying should be in a new team,
yeah,
because in Ajax they were pretty good. For his national team they're pretty good. So I would expect it should translate to the Premier League because I really rate him as a player. So there's nothing to suggest that that would not happen. And I'm going to ask you the same question I asked you off stream, which is if let's say Kudus and Bowen both play 90 minutes,
yeah.
who would you go for?
Yeah, I would say Kudus just because Bowen doesn't have penalties and there's a 1 million difference between the two.
Yeah, fair.
And that's pretty much what it comes down to. Plus, also, I don't really have that much confidence in West Ham's attack in general. So sometimes I even look at silly things like, for example, how much money am I spending on certain players?
Yeah,
And
fair.
yeah, like around that sort of price point, I'd rather own Kudus, but it's hard to justify owning both, I would say. And I think the only thing about Kulusevski is I'd say he's the one player where his underlying stats generally do stink compared to, let's say, Bowen, who has really, really good expected goals.
Yeah,
And Kudus, of course, as I said, we have a historic sort of baseline for him that's really good from another league. And then Kulusevski last season, of course, he was playing for I think he was playing for a terrible footballing team when it comes to
yeah,
attacking
yeah,
stats, and he pretty much has the same stats this season, as far as I understand. And obviously, he plays sort of shifting roles for this Tottenham team, right? He plays either center mid at times, or for example, he can just be shifted onto the wing as well. So that's one of those things where I think Kulusevski definitely makes sense that his baselines aren't great. But then I'm sometimes always left pondering, why someone like Bowen, for example, is still as low in terms of, for example, like the implied xG, for example, on review. That's something that we probably we'll have to sort of adjust to as we go towards the end of the season, I suppose, on some of these picks that we've mentioned. And I think that's why also probably starting from next week, we're going to also look at maybe creating that sort of graphic, recreating that,
yeah,
seeing
yeah,
the
exactly.
difference between, players on market, players on their actual underlying stats, and also just reviewed implied XG as well, just to see, is that something worth tracking, given the fact that we love models, but ultimately we're not sort of agnostic to other models as well. So why not just, for example, look at that, see if we can actually jump on trends, or if it makes sense sometimes to just trust review at times, which, as it turns out, obviously is perfectly fine in terms of FPL experience. And
Yeah, I'm
that,
going to say that this is kind of a derivative comparison because
mm,
we are trusting people who've made the first comparison
yeah,
between review and other models, and we trust that review is the best.
yeah,
And then
exactly,
now we are comparing review with market odds.
yeah,
Who are absolutely like there's absolute disconnect between review and market odds. So it's a good way to understand trends, I guess, and also, let's say, if review manages to close the gap on a particular player, we also kind of understand the inner workings of review.
true, yeah.
So in that way as well, it's a good way to see track it. So we'll see how that goes from next week. So next next topic is kind of related to that, which is plank rank, and I'm going to let Fran take center stage while I kind of support him from the shadows. But what do you think about plank rank,
I,
Fran?
I think I've got to say, last season was probably my first season sort of being in
Sorry,
touch
do you
with.
want to tell people what plank
Yeah,
rank is,
yeah.
by the way? Because
I'll get
yeah,
it. I'll get into that in a moment. I think
yeah,
in terms of, well, okay, fine. Let's go with plank rank first. So plank rank obviously is just what we previously had in terms of the season review on FPL Review's website, the way we evaluate what we consider to be quote unquote MD rank. Now, previously, this was done on the default minute expectations that review had basically at the end of the game week, and seeing, for example, as it turns out, obviously, whether you actually made good moves, I think, from a sort of MD accumulating point of view. So starting from, for example, your Game Week 1 wildcard, or obviously just your Game Week 1 team, to the way you, for example, implemented chip strategy over the course of the season, and your sort of cumulative transfers, how much expected value did you gain based on all of review's defaults. And as we know, those review defaults have gotten slightly worse this season. So I think if we were to say, shifting on from this or last season to this season, review has self-admittedly said that he spent less time on actually updating the default minutes, and that's something to be left for managers. And so
yeah,
the big change this season obviously is review previously had the season review based on that sort of default MD, evaluated, basically with foresight. And then now we actually have something which is the MD rank on season reviews actually reflected with hindsight minutes. So whatever minutes were actually played on a football field, sort of priced in with the actual baselines that we have in review. That's your sort of MD for the week that you've obtained. And it's
yeah,
basically all just coming down to whether, of course, first of all, you were lucky in the sense that you didn't have any injuries that you didn't know, or obviously players that you would have, let's say, predicted to play more minutes than the default review minutes have actually played, and therefore you've accumulated more expected value than, let's say, previous seasons' MD ratings would have actually afforded you. And plank rank is effectively the way we evaluate MD rank in previous seasons. So just looking at, for example, the four-side default minutes, which you can also sometimes, for example, just very, very quickly sense check with, for example, when you go in FPL optimized, and I think you look at I think that's also based on, for example, the 3 model. But it's a very similar process where you're just looking at default minutes.
Yeah.
What I have an issue with, I think, is we know that default minutes have gotten worse this season, and Review has self-admitted that, and I don't think that makes Review any worse as a model. In fact, it sort of encourages FPL managers to actually adjust their minutes as they see fit, sort of put their interpretation of the FPL landscape of what managers conceive their players to play, to the best of their ability, and make transfers based on that. Obviously, there's still variance within this season's MD rank because, as I said, you can have a player who gets injured in the middle of the game. That hurts. You can have a player who played fantastically and gets hooked at 70 minutes because they're winning 5-0. Those kind of things will obviously sort of have a negative impact on the way your variance, quote unquote, is perceived. But I still think that that's better because most of the time, I would say for 10 out of 12-year players, right, captaincy included, you're making good decisions on evaluating their actual minutes, and you're hopefully being reflected the right outcomes, unless you're getting a ridiculous, let's say, outcome with injuries, which obviously would affect you in any season, right? If you have bad injuries, because that's going to have a correlative effect on your team value, and obviously that's going to make your season stink no matter what. So we've seen that, for example, with your season last year, where I think Bench Boost 1 didn't really work out particularly well, and that basically just had a cascading impact on your MD.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's going to happen as well, I think, with Review MD rank as it's stated now. I personally just think that I like being rewarded for that, and I think plank rank is a bit ridiculous, particularly if I was to cite a few examples. For example, I remember very distinctly when Chilwell got his first benching before the Aston Villa fixture, we knew that Chilwell actually immediately became a rotation risk. Not only after that did we think that Chilwell was a rotation risk, a lot of people actually actioned moves away from Chilwell. However, Review's default minutes for Chilwell at that time was still something like 65 minutes, and that basically implies that Chilwell is going to start. But you're not being rewarded for sort of acknowledging that a manager has changed their estimation of a player if you're going to get rewarded for the default minutes of Chilwell, which would be completely wrong. And in the inverse situation, I think Luke is a great example of this. Someone, or even, for example, Angie Ball, MD1, or FPL Critic, going into players like maybe Darwin, Zinchenko even, I would say, where, look, I've made my own complaints about Zinchenko because I just think that, for example, Arsenal sometimes will rotate Zinchenko, but
the circumstances around Zinchenko.
But the thing is, if you've sort of justified getting those minutes and you've predicted that, let's say, Darwin has become an emerging player and that he's actually clearly first choice, you should be rewarded for it. And the fact that Review is a little bit cautious with that is totally fine, because that's just, for example, leaving you to your own devices. But you're not going to be rewarded, for example, on plank rank for that, and it makes absolutely no sense to even tempt yourself with those transfers if you're not going to be rewarded for it, in my opinion. And for me, I think that's just crazy. I remember when I owned Gusto as well, there was a while where Reece James was injured and his X-Mins weren't even close to, for example, like 80 to 90. So
yeah, exactly.
Those sort of circumstances shouldn't really happen, but they do. And that's the sort of issue that we have with default minutes right now. So I just don't see why would we be sort of trusting in or even evaluating plank rank as if it's going to give us any sort of positive benefit, particularly knowing that default minutes have gotten worse and worse. Which is something that, as I said, as someone who actually pays and uses Review very often, I'm totally fine with, because for what Review is as a service, in my opinion, I'm more than happy with what I pay for, and I'm very, very happy with the product. But I do all of this knowing that I adjust my minutes, and I'd like to be rewarded for it. And I think the way we have MD rank set up now is so much better than if we were to evaluate defaults. If we ever entered a landscape where Review's default minutes actually made sense to me, because I actually try to look at most teams very often, and I adjust at least probably 15 to 20 players each week in terms of MD minutes, just because I think, for example, if let's say Review can't make a decision, and I think last season's example with Critic was very good. There was a point in time where Aston Villa were playing Buendia every single game for 80 to 90 minutes. However, his defaults were literally stuck at 70 to 75. I mean, what sense does that even make when you're playing an FPL season and you're actually adjusting minutes as you should, and not getting rewarded for that? So yeah,
and you're making decisions based on those adjustments, right? So
exactly. Yeah.
If one thing doesn't make sense, then as you pointed out for my bench boost one, the cascading effect is even worse.
Exactly.
So Sorry, I'm going to let you continue, but I completely agree with all the factors that you brought up, which is why with the lack of attention to default minutes this season, it just makes no sense to me. Like it's absolutely irrelevant as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I think that's where I've landed, and ultimately, to be honest, you can have a great plank rank and have a great MD rank.
Yes.
I've seen Yans, I've seen Pingreens. They have like astoundingly good ranks on both, and that would make that for me is a good evaluation. That's a very good mix. I'd probably still favor it, as I said, because of what I don't really like about the default minutes this season is I definitely lean towards the direction of looking at, for example, the non-defaults. Because even, for example, like just to bring up Luke again, I mean, when he got those Alvarez minutes right, and he was predicting accurately that Alvarez would get very, very healthy minutes, there was a strong while where Alvarez's minutes on review weren't very, very good.
No, they weren't.
And things like that. Or even conversely, for example, João Pedro's minutes have been really good at various points in the season, where actually his minutes have been frankly awful. So
Yeah.
yeah, as someone, even myself, who entered into João Pedro game week 1 and knew I needed to move on away from him, I don't want to be rewarded, for example, for keeping him for an absurd amount of time. So
No, but
that's
you
sort of
also don't want to be punished unfairly, because what will happen is, let's say there are two managers, one manager like you who got rid of Pedro early on, the
yeah,
other didn't.
yeah,
That person will still continue to get good MD rank from João Pedro despite him not starting.
yeah,
And you've lost out on that MD rank for what? For no reason, because you correctly predicted something and you got punished for it. So I understand the trade-off, by the way. Like, no one is pretending as if there isn't a trade-off here
yeah,
by switching to actual minutes. You're increasing the noise in within minutes because of injuries and early substitutions due to game state and all that stuff.
absolutely,
But all things given, I still err on the side of actual minutes, because I want to be rewarded more than I am okay to be punished. Like, for example, my propensity to be rewarded is more. Like, okay, I will be punished. Like, we both of us got punished for Holland captaincy against Bournemouth, starting Sterling against who was it? The game before Burnley, where he was ill and he came on as a sub.
Bournemouth, yeah,
Bournemouth.
yeah,
Came on as a sub against Bournemouth. You got a Gusto red card. I got an as a 45-minute sub with an injury. So we have had our fair share of these things. It's not as if we are immune and we've had, stellar seasons. So we are saying, oh, let's just get rid of default minutes. It's with all those things happening. Even with all those things happening, I'm still okay with using actual minutes for sure.
yeah. I'll also
Yeah.
add 45 minutes from Richarlison, thanks to
Yes.
Basuma. Add to that. But yeah,
Yes.
I think
Yes.
I think that's totally fair. We've had our fair share of bad situations, but yeah, we're happy to overcome it because the end result from MD rank is definitely still better than plank rank as it stands. So
Yeah.
those are my
Exactly.
thoughts. Let's just quickly close off this really, really long episode, which has been enjoyable for me actually, with captaincy as per usual.
Yes. So captaincy. Oh, I'm going to let Fran talk about Salah. I'm just going to quickly mention the names and get to Fran because he has an interesting observation about Salah. So the top three choices are Salah at 1, Son at 2, and Holland at 3. Uh, Holland's fixture is quite tricky compared to what Salah and Son have. So I definitely understand why this is the case.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm going to be captaining Salah. So it's not even a question of looking at Son or Holland, and I own all three of them. What do you think about captaincy this week?
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, with Salah, I think I don't think I remember a point in the season. Maybe Holland has been close versus Bournemouth, but he's basically at 8 expected value, which is, I mean, you're basically implying that he's scoring more than a goal potentially, or obviously, there's bonus as well priced in and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
but
But
if you like ignore that, yeah.
exactly, that's just mental, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, he's got chances to assist and sell, but just crazy to me. And it just shows, of course, as you mentioned, that Sheffield United really are that bad of a team. Not only are, I mean, they could really be potentially the joint, for example, worst team that we've seen, right? And for example, like the analytical data era where we have, access to XG and XGC of teams for the whole course of the season. Yeah, they're very comfortably the worst offense and the worst defense in the league, and that says a lot. I think you can probably glean as much from them losing, as you said, to 5-0 to Burnley, which is inexcusable, given that Burnley are probably their rival for that
Yeah.
for those two titles, respectively. And yeah, I think Salah is the very, very clear standout captaincy. But like we saw, for example, in the Etihad fixture, the Spurs attack isn't really a joke. They did obviously accumulate only sub 1 XG, and Son ended up with 1 goal, 1 assist, and also an own goal. But yeah, this Tottenham team, look, they're facing versus basically a bottom five defense in West Ham right now, right? I think West Ham sits 17th in expected goals conceded. So, look, two basically amazing fixtures for both Son and Salah. The difference, of course, is that Salah's away from home, Son is at home. Maybe actually this could be a great gambit for people who don't own Salah, I would say, to go into Son. Because I think the drop off from, let's say, Salah to Haaland or even Son to Haaland is quite huge. So for me, it's between Salah and Son. But really, because of what Sheffield United have shown us this season, I think it'd be wrong for me to ignore a Salah captaincy here. And there's still quite a big EV gulf, as we said, between Salah and Son himself.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we close off this episode, we can quickly maybe look at some chat questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's make it a quick fire thing. If we have already spoken about it, let's just try to give a 1 or 2 word answer and move on to the next question. Do you want to take the first one? Because I think it's addressed to you.
Sure. Which one would that be?
It's by bar, I think. By bar, it says your friend.
Okay, from the top, yeah. SA to Huang or
Yeah,
Gordon.
yeah, yeah.
I think Huang, if you've got a wild card, or otherwise just go Gordon. Obviously keep in mind that Gordon has 2 away fixtures, so that's obviously a bit tough. But I think because if you're, let's say, concerned about Palmer, just go Gordon.
Yeah. The next question is by, I'm not going to pronounce this because it's actually gibberish. So thoughts on Dubravka, worth a hit to get him early for the good rotation with Areola? No. If you're taking a hit, postpone it for next week. If it's a free transfer, go for it. Yeah.
Yeah, then Lars asks whether he thinks White should start versus Luton. I think, yeah, it just comes down to the
Yeah.
Tomiyasu injury, but I think I would be expecting it, given that I don't see what's the risk, or what the reason would be to risk Tomiyasu immediately.
Absolutely. K7 asks, what of Martinelli, guys? I mean, he's been pretty underwhelming. So we haven't actually spoken about him. So if you have any thoughts, Ryan, I wouldn't go for him, and I would try to move him on because he's not on penalties. He's not playing 90 minutes. There is no reason for you to keep him, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you also look at expected value, a lot of that might be just coming down, like, week to week, with actually the fact that he has a really high implied clean sheet percentage. And that also sort of looks very healthy. But actually, his underlying stats are pretty underwhelming. Arsenal's attacks still look underwhelming, even though for a moment we thought that we were watching a Champions League game versus Wolves because they actually managed to score goals in the first half. But yeah, I think, as you said, Martinelli's minutes aren't absolutely certain. I would still say he's probably around 75 to 80 minutes. But that's probably not good enough in this landscape when you can actually probably redistribute those funds in another way. I think it makes sense to move off of Martinelli after this fixture, though. Obviously, I would give him the Luton game
Yes.
and then
Yes.
reevaluate. Whereas maybe even Odegaard makes a bit more sense, given that he's also dropped a little bit in price and he would probably be playing 90 minutes. But it also doesn't seem to make too much sense to spend that much money in the midfield when you need to own. When, for example, like just outright, maybe I would rather actually own Trent or something like that.
Fair enough. Or even Trippier. I agree with you there. The next question is, okay, so Flapjack is saying we need to send Sharon a rating back. Flapjack, if you want to, I'm happy to accept it. Or sorry, he says a hat, not a bag. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to wear the hat, but yeah, I'll keep it as a memento for sure. The next question is, I'm losing faith a little with Adingra. Really want Palmer. I think you can hold off this week. Adingra is still going to play 90 minutes. You can check to see if Palmer is fit or not and what's the situation against United away. And if he starts, you know that everything is good, and then you can bring him in for game week 16, where the real fun starts for Chelsea.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I think the only thing with Brighton is that game week 16 is not too bad for them, right? Because they've got Burnley at home.
Fair, fair.
Yeah,
Actually, Fran is
exactly.
right. I would actually then not even do it for 16. Maybe postpone it for
Yeah,
even
17's
later. Yeah.
Sheffield United at home for Chelsea, so just wait until then, I would say.
Yes. Yeah. Perfect.
Yeah. All right. Next question was, yeah, I think so. We've answered Bar's question. The next question from K7 again was when to get Solanke, and I think Solanke has a good fixture again. And in general, this I think with Solanke, the only thing I'd say about the forwards is that none of the sort of forwards below Solanke's price are really nailed or post healthy enough numbers for us to say that they're actually good picks. So if you're, for example, actually in that sort of landscape where you have 8 attackers and you're looking for the third one, and Solanke could be them, I would just transfer Solanke in as immediately as possible. Because if you're even considering Solanke, you probably have the money to get him. But if you're, let's say, on a 3-5-2, Solanke still, in my opinion, doesn't make sense if you own Haaland plus Salah. So it really just depends on what your team structure is.
Absolutely. Yeah. Next question is by Lars. What to do with Darwin and Simicas for the Sheffield United? Yeah,
I think
we've
we actually
already
answered
talked
that one
about it
like
at length.
directly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Exactly. So just rewind to that part of the pod, I think. Next question is okay, this is we just had a conversation with Luke. Pondering, so Lars again says, pondering keeping Diaby for 18, have 8 attackers. Yeah, if you can bench him, sure.
Yeah.
But I don't see any reason why not. Maybe the situation changes. You get some more information. I think Diaby has not dropped in price yet, right? From when he went up by 0.1.
Yeah, I don't think so. No.
Yeah, so if that's the case, and if you bought him for 0.1 less, then definitely there's no need to transfer him out. I think the more you can wait for information, I would definitely do that.
Yeah, I agree with that. So first of all, hey Trini. But then Eddie asks, should I sell Turner or Areola? I think it still makes sense to sell Turner unless you have, for example, some moves in the distance that actually you really need that 0.4 in your team. Otherwise, I for example have the same situation as you where I'm going to go Dubravka probably, and I have Turner or Areola to get out of. As I said, it probably makes more sense to go out of Turner. Areola actually rotates half decently with Dubravka. Obviously, I don't have too much confidence in Areola, but fixtures are fixtures. For example, I think eventually at one point West Ham get to play Sheffield United, so why not, for example, enjoy that fixture as well?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the subset of his question was if sell Turner, get Dubravka basically, and if sell Martinelli. First of all, we would not recommend, as Fran already talked about, keep him for Luton and reassess. Luis Bonilla says, no, there's no question. It just says Watkins, Cunha. Mr. Blanky says, should I get Lascelles for Guehi? He's going to rise in price tonight.
No, I think is the answer.
No,
I think this
no,
first of
no.
all, Guehi is a great fixture.
Yes.
The Newcastle game, like for example, if you're moving from Areola to Turner, as your starting goalkeeper, that's fair enough. That's an actual upgrade, right? The
You mean
fixture.
Dubravka, right?
No. As yeah, sorry. As in, if you're moving from
Yeah.
Areola to Dubravka, that's obviously just an
Yeah.
upgrade in terms of the fixture that you
Yes.
have. Because Tottenham away is so much worse in the context of owning a West Ham defender there than let's
Yes.
say a Newcastle defender playing versus Everton away. Whereas, for example, you're moving here from Bournemouth at home for Crystal Palace
Yeah.
into a pretty poor fixture for Newcastle standards, just because Everton, we actually do rate them as a good offensive team now.
Yes.
So yeah, I probably wouldn't do that. I do think making that Dubravka move for Johnson, you can also wait once again. Very, very similarly with that sort of logic for the next week. I would actually probably just persist with the Crystal Palace players for this week. And if you actually are able to roll, then you can just wait for news. And probably by next week as well, you might actually get better news on Pope as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Should I bring in Mr. Blanky's next question is, should I bring in Dubravka for Johnston? No. As we've talked about already, makes no sense because Johnson has a great fixture, and also Johnson is a good goalkeeper for the blank game week as well. So
Yeah.
I
Although
know
to be fair, so is
Dubravka is as
Dubravka as
well.
well. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly, but then it doesn't make sense to use a transfer
Right.
because both of them, unless you want to desperately use that difference in price,
Mm.
I just don't see that. I would rather you use Dubravka as your second goalkeeper and keep Johnston for as the first goalkeeper.
Last question is Simicast to transfer out to someone like Porro this week? I think Porro is actually probably
Mm,
the priority defender transfer this week,
mm.
but not out from Simicast. I would
Yeah,
try and find somewhere else in your team to afford that transfer. Just because, if anything, ideally I think I would like to have Simicast and Porro, assuming that Simicast plays again, which that could be tight. If you think Simicast will be benched, and let's say for example, if you actually let's say don't have a third defender that's capable of playing this week, then I don't actually think it's a bad move, in my opinion. Because Simicast, as you mentioned yourself, is probably going to be a transfer out on Game Week 16, right?
yeah,
If, let's say, you
yeah.
assume his minutes to be something like 60, 66, which actually they seem to be slightly higher
It's
than
fair.
that. But I think
Yeah.
Porro is astoundingly good and also good on Game Week 18. So I do think actually it's a decent transfer if you must.
Yeah, I'm all on board for getting Porro in. As you said, maybe not for Simicas, but Porro is probably the one defender who I see and think, why don't I own this player? That's probably the only defender I think. And yeah, those are all the questions I think. So thank you everyone for tuning in. We had to stream today because of the early turnaround. It's a Tuesday deadline, so make sure you don't forget about it. Uh, if you are here till the end of the stream, make sure to like, subscribe, and share the podcast around. Uh, Unfortunately, we couldn't get the previous podcast out on podcasting platforms because of a lack of turnaround time. But we'll make sure we get that in this week. So appreciate all the support from you, and see you next week.
All right, take care, guys, and I'll see you guys next week.